Henry VIII gleefully exclaimed, "I cooked the cook," after, on his orders, Richard Roose, a humble cook, was boiled to death in 1531 in London. It is one of the grisliest executions in British history. Its pain and cruelty unsurprisingly characteristic of the monarch whose reign is famous for the highest number of executions, two of which were of his own wives. Hi, I am Rima and this is Historia Maxima, where we talk about history, its wonderful stories and the lessons it could possibly teach us. John Fisher was the Bishop of Rochester. In the early afternoon of 18th February 1531, Fisher and a number of his guests were dining together at his house in southwest London. It was a regular lunch, cooked by Fisher's household cooks. What should have been a pretty uneventful meal turned out to be one that ended up changing English laws and one of the most frighteningly painful executions ever. Once the food was served to all of Fisher's guests, it was also given away as charity. But soon after the meal, towards the evening, about 17 people who had eaten the meal fell violently ill. To make matters worse, 2 amongst those people who'd eaten that ill-fated meal died. This soon became quite sensational news across England for many reasons. For one, poisoning was a common fear among the people, especially the nobility. Second, this had happened at the home of one of the most influential men in England, and that too one who was a man of God. John Fisher was the Bishop of Rochester, and third, Fisher himself had not actually eaten the meal that afternoon, even though he was present in the house at the time. The cook of Fisher's household was Richard Roose, who was promptly arrested. He was taken to the Tower of London, where he was questioned on the rack. If you don't know what the rack was, it was a torture device where the victim was tied up, and slowly, as the interrogation progressed, the victim's joints of shoulders, elbows, hips, knees would be dislocated. Richard's fate was pretty clear. But apart from its chilling cruelty, what makes this event of history important is that there is more to the story. It was not just a simple execution for poisoning. Richard Roose was never actually tried for the crime, so he never actually got to argue his side. For all we know, he might have been tricked into adding poison to the meal. And that's because Richard may have been a pawn in a much bigger game. So what was the much bigger game? Let's back up a little. Henry VIII had become enamored with one of the ladies-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn, of his first wife, Katherine of Aragon, but Anne refused to sleep with the king before marriage. As a result, Henry had been trying to persuade both the Pope and the English Church to grant him a divorce from Catherine so he might marry Boleyn. What happened as a result was that 2 factions emerged: those who were on the side of Henry and Anne and therefore supported his divorce, and those who did not support them. John Fisher, the man in whose house the poisonings happened, was on the opposing side of Henry and Anne. Fisher was vociferous both in his defense of Katherine of Aragon and attacks on Boleyn. The passion with which Fisher defended Katherine of Aragon angered both Henry and Boleyn, who, quote, feared no one in England more than Fisher, because he had always defended Catherine without respect of persons, end quote. So Fisher and the Boleyn family were not exactly friends. One time, Anne Boleyn advised Fisher not to attend Parliament, where he was expected to condemn the king and her. In case, Boleyn ominously suggested Fisher, quote, caught some disease as he had before, end quote. Fisher ignored her, went ahead and attended Parliament. Historians agree that it was during this when, upon failure of theological argument, more proactive i.e. physical force solutions, began to be considered by Fisher's opponents. This is one reason why it was widely rumored that the poisoning in Fisher's house may actually have been either Anne's or Anne's father's doing in order to get Fisher out of the way. If true, that wouldn't be the first time actually. Sometime before this event, at least one other attempt had already been made on Fisher's life when a cannon was fired towards Fisher's residence from the direction of Anne's father, Thomas, Earl of Wiltshire's house. Fortunately for Fisher, no one was hurt. All he suffered were some damages to the roof of his house. Perhaps that's why the scholar John Matushak said that, quote, no other critic of the divorce among the kingdom's elites would, in fact, be more outspoken, and no opponent of the looming breach with Rome would be treated to such levels of intimidation, end quote, as Fisher. Roose's execution may have been just another form of intimidation, if not a downright attempt on Fisher's life. The Spanish Jesuit Pedro de Ribadeneyra, writing in the 1590s, at least 60 years after the incident, placed the blame firmly on Boleyn herself, writing how she had hated Rochester, Fisher, ever since he had taken up Catherine's cause so vigorously, and her hatred inspired her to hire Roose to commit murder. As soon as the 18th February 1531 poisoning incident happened, Henry VIII addressed the House of Lords and was responsible for an Act of Parliament which retroactively made murder by poison a treasonous offence, mandating execution by boiling. Roose was boiled to death at London's Smithfield on 15th April 1532. It took approximately 2 hours. The contemporary chronicle of the Grey Friars of London described how Roose was tied up in chains and then lowered in and out of the boiling water 3 times until he died. It is suggested that the symbolism of his boiling was not just a reference to Roose's trade or out of a desire to simply cause him as much pain as possible. Rather, it was carefully chosen to reenact the crime itself, in which Roose boiled poison into the broth. This inextricably linked the crime with its punishment in the eyes of contemporaries. A Londoner described how Roose died, and this part is pretty gory. He roared mighty loud, and divers women who were big with child did feel sick at the sight of what they saw, and were carried away half dead. And other men and women did not seem frightened by the boiling alive, but would prefer to see the headsman at his work. It seems even after all of this, John Fisher was not an easy man to intimidate. In 1535, he opposed the Acts of Supremacy which established the English monarch, Henry VIII, as head of the Church of England. By this time, Henry was no longer playing. He finally ordered John Fisher's beheading, adding his name as well to the ever-growing list of executions of his reign. And just a year later, Anne Boleyn's name too would be added to the list, just when she too became an inconvenient pawn in the game.